good page coming up. How's your Sunday going? We are holding by Shabbos 3. Shabbos is the second tractate of the Talmud, and we're on the second page of Masechet Shabbos, Daf Gimel. Who's tuning in? Where are you in from? How are you coping? It's a lot of fear in the air. A lot of fear, a lot of misinformation. Been checking the CDC, Centers of Disease Control website. That's where the most up-to-date and most reliable information is. And according to the CDC, we've got to keep a perspective, right? If you have a reason to believe you've been exposed to the virus, okay, then you have to take much greater precautions. But if you're just a normal person in a normal place with no particular connection to someone who traveled or who's been exposed to the disease, God forbid, so take normal precautions for flu season, wash your hands a lot, avoid coming to close contact with people. If you have symptoms, totally different story. Then for sure you've got to remove yourself from the population, as it were, until you've been tested and declared well, and who knows how long you'll have to take, but follow the guidelines of the CDC. So far, in a country with 300 million people, the number of actual cases, actual exposure is tiny. So we have to use common sense and not let fear run us out of our minds. Very good. Let's just say a quick prayer, my friends, for the people who have been exposed, who are suffering, who are in fear. May they receive a complete and speedy recovery. May their loved ones have a complete and speedy recovery. And may we not be exposed to this COVID virus at all. May we all remain healthy. All right. Who's tuning in? Who's the first that's going to tell me that you're tuning in from somewhere? What states, what cities are in the house? All right, here we go. Rick Wise says, please say a prayer for the tornado victims of Nashville. Thank you, Rick. Thank you. God, this is a much bigger emergency for people in Tennessee. Devastating tornadoes have ripped through the state of Tennessee. People have been killed, homes destroyed. The people who are injured, may they have a complete recovery. Those who are in mourning, it's terrible. May they be strengthened, may they be comforted. May they find the strength to pick up the pieces, put their lives together. And may they do something to honor the ones who have been taken away prematurely, and may something good happen in their name. And let us say amen. Okay, so we're in chapter 1 of Tractate Shabbos, and as we started yesterday, there's some complexity here, right? Our first volume of the Talmud, Brachos, was just replete with wisdom, teachable teachings, as it were, right? Remember we had Bar Kapara, who rarely spoke, but when he did, his sayings were worth money, right? And there was lots of that kind of stuff in Tractate Brachos, and eventually we'll come to that kind of wisdom in Tractate Shabbos as well. But here at the outset, the editors of the Talmud want us to know that it's going to take incisive intellect and analysis in order to break down these rules. It's not going to be easy. And today we're going to encounter what happens when having, a true interpretation of the law butts into policy considerations. In other words, if we interpret the law exactly as it's written, people might end up getting hurt in unexpected situations. And how do we account for that? So we will be exploring that. But just to review one important concept from yesterday, here in Tractate Shabbos, we have to be able to understand the terms liable, exempt, and permitted in the context of Tractate Shabbos. Basically, liable means one has violated a Torah prohibition. He did it inadvertently. Okay, if you violate a Torah prohibition intentionally, like you knew you were doing it and you did it, okay, so you're gonna have a problem with heaven. Heaven is gonna deal with that. But while the temple was standing, if you violated a Torah prohibition inadvertently, meaning you didn't realize you were violating a law, or you just made a mistake, you thought you were carrying something in a private domain. It turned out to be a public domain. You should have known, but you didn't. So then you could bring the sin offering, the chatas, right? And so liable to the sin, liable means liable to bring a sin offering, something you could do when the temple stood. Exempt in this tractate means you did not violate the Torah prohibition, so you are not liable to bring a sin offering. Rather, you are exempt from bringing a sin offering, but the thing that we're talking about is still prohibited by the rabbis. And this is the difference between doraita or doraisa, depending on your pronunciation, and derabbanan, okay? Meaning biblically prohibited versus rabbinically prohibited. Why would the rabbis enact prohibitions that are not in the Torah? To protect the population from coming to violate a biblical prohibition. In other words, they put a fence around the Torah. It was predictable that people will make mistakes, that they will come to violate these prohibitions, and so the rabbis enacted prohibitions that are not in the Torah, but which will protect people from coming to violate the Torah prohibition. And finally, there is permitted. Something that is permitted is not violating neither a biblical prohibition nor a rabbinic prohibition. It's permitted. However, sometimes in this tractate, and this is why we're mentioning this, there are some exceptions where exempt means both exempt and permitted. And here on page 3, we have 3 examples of behaviors that are somewhat questionable, but turn out to be exempt and permitted, not just exempt, but rabbinically prohibited. What are they? The 3 cases are trapping a deer, trapping a poisonous snake, and lancing a boil. These are things that you would think you cannot do on Shabbat. Now, you cannot go out on Shabbat, put a trap on the ground so that a deer will come along and step in it and be trapped, right? That's trapping. Trapping is like hunting, right? Trapping animals so that you could, if you trap, a deer is a kosher animal, right? You cannot shoot a deer like with a bow and arrow, because then you would not have shechted it properly. You would not have slaughtered it properly. It was not a kosher slaughter, so you could not eat it. But you could trap a deer so that then you could come later and slaughter it properly and eat it. But you can't trap it on Shabbat. Why is this one of the forbidden labors, the 39 forbidden labors on Shabbat? Because you would use animal hides as well for constructing the tabernacle in the desert. So there was a need to trap animals for certain things. In fact, the tabernacle, its outer covering, it was made out of tachash skins. And if you've ever heard Nina and I do our presentation, pardon me, called Shnooks at Sinai or Shnooks in the desert, it's the story of how those tachash skins came to be part of the tabernacle. At any rate, trapping is something you can't do. In this case, the very particular case, right now, many of these cases that the rabbis will name are things that are just never going to happen in real life, but we create that hypothetical situation in order to understand what the law would be. And it is because our sages engaged in these kind of hypothetical cases that they actually created laws 2,000 years ago which can apply today. Right, like for instance, eventually we'll come to a law of what happens if meat falls from the sky. Right, it's already meat. It's from a kosher animal. We don't know how it was shechted. It's just like a steak fell from the sky, and that actually is going to be relevant when modern sages have to ask the question: what if meat could be, genetically created, like grown in a lab? It actually is meat. It has the DNA of meat, but it was never part of a living and walking and breathing animal. Is that going to be kosher? That's a question that still hasn't been settled, but these kind of hypothetical cases from 2,000 years ago would certainly come into play in figuring that out. So the case of trapping the deer is a deer wanders into your house. If you sit in the doorway, the deer can't get out. It's not a very, it's a small doorway, right? You can imagine a deer, if you're in that doorway, he'll just charge and just jump over you. But imagine that it's a small deer, you're a big person, it's a small doorway, He wandered into the house, and if you sit in the doorway, he's trapped. Now, the action that you took was just sitting. You just sat in your doorway. Normally, what's wrong with that? There's no problem sitting wherever you are on Shabbat. There's nothing prohibited about that. In this case, it will have the effect of trapping the deer. There's actually a little bit of a dispute about this law. Some say that the person you can't sit in your doorway because you know it will trap the deer. Others say, so he can't sit there, but if a second person sits right next to him, and then the first one stands up and leaves, so now you're sitting there, you've created a trap for the deer, but when you sat, you didn't trap the deer. It was that first person who did it. Have you now, if you stay there, have you trapped a deer? Are you violating Shabbos? And in this case, this is exempt and permitted, right? The person has done nothing wrong. Another case is if you trap a poisonous snake. Now, the snake is not a kosher animal. You wouldn't trap it to eat it, but perhaps you might trap it because you needed the hide. You were going to use the snake skin for something. Maybe you were going to make a wallet out of it. Maybe you were going to use the snake meat to feed it to your dog. So you would not be allowed to do that on Shabbat. But if it's a poisonous snake and you're trapping it just so that it's contained in a safe area and it won't escape from that and come to bite somebody, right, endanger them on Shabbat, so then you can do that, right? It's exempt. Even though it's trapping on Shabbat, you're going to be exempt from the biblical prohibition, and it's going to be fully permitted. The rabbis won't stop you from doing that, even rabbinically, because we don't want to create a policy where we had a chance to save people from being in danger, and we didn't do it, right? And then the third case is lancing a boil. Why would you not do that? I mean, there's a couple of reasons why. Taking a needle into a boil, it's like practicing medicine. It's not really necessary. You're not going to save a life by lancing that boil. You may not even create discomfort or relieve discomfort, but people would rather not have a pus-filled boil. So if you're just putting the needle into the boil to drain the pus, so that's okay. You're not doing it to create a permanent condition regarding the rest of your skin, which actually has to do with construction. That's a matter for another day. But these were three cases where exempt means exempt and permitted. These are the exceptions that prove the rule. Normally in this tractate, and we're going to be here for another 150 pages, another 150 days, 5 months. Normally in this tractate, exempt means it's exempt from the biblical prohibition. You're exempt from bringing a sin offering because you violated a biblical prohibition, but it's still prohibited rabbinically. Okay. On this page, we also have from Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, the source for the idea we encountered yesterday that if one person picks up an object in a private domain, walks into a public domain, and deposits it in the public domain, he has transferred from one domain to another on Shabbat, he is liable to the sin offering, right? But if one person picks it up in the private domain and sticks his hand through the doorway, and the other person takes it from his hand, okay, and now walks in the public domain and puts it down in the public domain, so both of them are exempt. They've both done something that's prohibited according to the rabbis, but they're exempt from bringing the sin offering because neither did the complete action himself. They combined to do it. What is the source for that in the Torah? Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi brings it down from Leviticus 4:27, and the verse there is, "And if one soul sins unwittingly from the people of the land, when he does it, one of the laws of God that should not be done, and he is responsible." Right? And then what's going to follow is what you do about it, bringing the sin offering. But the words "when he does it" are extraneous, right? It could have just said, "And if one soul sins unwittingly from the people of the land, one of the laws of God that should not be done, and he is responsible." He is responsible, right? He did it. He is responsible, not somebody else. They didn't need to also say "when he does it," right? Why that extra phrase? And from that phrase, we learn out when he does it, right? He, by himself, the complete action. He's not part of a team that in parts completes the action. He did it himself. Right. We have a distinction here. If, right, so we had the case of the poor man outside the door and the homeowner inside the house, right? And if, right, so if the poor man reaches into the house and the homeowner places an object in his hand, so the homeowner picked up the object in the private domain, then the poor man outside pulled that object outside of the house. This is that case where they combine. Both are exempt from the sin offering, but they both violated a rabbinic prohibition. They combine to do the sin. However, we distinguish that case from if the poor man walked inside the house and the rich man and the homeowner loaded fruit into his backpack, right? So the poor man, lucky day, he's got somebody who's not just going to give him one apple, he's going to give him a whole bunch of apples. So he comes inside the house, he's got a backpack on him, and the homeowner puts 40 apples into the backpack. And then the poor man walks outside the house from the private domain into the public domain. Sounds like a very similar case to poor man reaches inside the house, homeowner puts an apple in his hand, and the poor man retracts his hand back out into the public domain. But the cases are not the same. And the reason they're not the same is because when the poor man enters the house, his body is in the house. And even though he does not pick up the apples from the ground, rather the homeowner picks up the apples and puts them into his backpack, because the poor man stepped into the house, his body is in the house, and now his body is considered at rest in the house, unlike when he just stuck his hand through the doorway. A hand is not substantial. A body is, right? So when the body is all the way in the house, and now he accepts to get, somebody just helps him load stuff in, he's still responsible as if, it was his intentionality that things should be picked up by him, right, onto his person, go into the backpack, and then he walked through the door outside. So in that case, the poor man is liable to the sin offering. This is distinguished from when he reached in with his hand, right? The hand becomes a hypothetical domain, right? So when the poor man who's outside reaches in with his hand doesn't come to rest inside the house, right? And the homeowner is able to put something in that hand, and the guy's able to withdraw it. The hand itself, right, is not considered. It's neither a private domain nor a public domain. It has qualities of each. It belongs to a person who's standing in the public domain. It is situated in the private domain, but it's not really in the private domain. And so the sages named this a Karmelis or a Karmelit, right? A Karmelis. And it's just, there are no Karmelises in the world. They're just something that attains that status temporarily while, other activities are going on so that we can evaluate what happened. So that's how we define this Karmelis. It's neither public domain nor private domain. It has qualities of each, and it's going to come into our analyses of different cases along the way. Another rule that we encounter here is the idea of airspace. If the homeowner sticks his hand, like he picked up an apple inside the house, and now he sticks his hand through the door, and he just holds it in the air above the ground outside the house, so in the public domain. If he does that less than 10 hand breadths from the ground, it has a different impact than if he extended his hand above 10 hand breadths from the ground, right? So hand breadths like this. Hand breadth is maybe about 4 inches. So think about it like approximately 40 inches. So within 40 inches of the ground is considered the airspace of the ground and has the same status as the ground. So if you stick your hand out low, okay, so then you it's like as if you put your hand on the ground. But if you stick your hand out high, it's still in this indeterminate status, right? You haven't really done anything. You're out there in the air, and you can retract it back. So this is the law of airspace. As they're working out, what is the impact of the hand in the airspace, the hand that can go out into the public space? Can it be retracted? Somebody asks a question that's not on point, right? And so here we have a nice interjection from Rabbi Chia, who says to Rav that when Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, is involved in this Masechet, in this tractate, and he's involved in answering a very difficult, complicated question like what we're dealing with, don't ask him questions pertaining to another tractate, because you could embarrass him, right? To get ready to teach us this, he prepared himself. It was difficult, and he's working on giving us the answer to questions in this tractate. If we now go and ask him a question pertaining to another tractate, we could throw him off, we could distract him, he won't know the answer, he could get confused, he'll come to be embarrassed. So it's a law, it's actually a law, it's a Jewish law, Hebrew law, right? A halacha, that when somebody's teaching us something, we try to keep our questions to the subject that he's teaching and not bring up some other subject just because we were curious about it, we were reminded of it, but it is not what the person is trying to teach. That comes from Rabbi Chia. And then finally, we're starting to encounter this idea of policy versus absolute truth. So we have the case of a person who extended his hand out of a private domain, right? So he's standing in the private domain, he's got an object in his hand, and he extends his arm out into the public place, right? So if he now puts something down in the public space, so he did it, he would be liable to the sin offering because he picked up in the private domain and deposited in the public domain. But while his hand is still out there and he hasn't put it down in the public domain, he's in a state of suspension. It's like his hand is that Karmelis now, right? He hasn't done a transfer yet. The question is, what do we tell him to do? Because let's say the first case is he extended his hand before night fell on Friday. So it was not Shabbat. There's no prohibition on, transferring an object from the public domain or from the private domain to the public domain or vice versa when it's not Shabbat. Fully permitted. But let's say he extended his hand out there, he got distracted, he fell asleep, who knows how this happened, and night fell. Right? So now the object is outside in the public domain, and this guy, his arm is stuck out there, and the question is, can he retract his hand with the object in it? If he pulls it back in, now if he does this below 10 hand breadths, right? So then he's in the airspace of the public domain, so like that object is in the public domain. If he now pulls his hand back in, so then he violated Shabbos. He violated the biblical prohibition. So we want to get him out of that situation. We'd rather he can just deposit it. But there's a problem of uncertainty here. And if we make that ruling that he can deposit it there, are we going to be encouraging people to get into that situation? Now, this case is so odd and so extreme that it's hard for us to understand that there's policy implications. And what we're trying to decide is, who do we want to protect? Are we trying to protect people from making the intentional action of sticking their hand out there because they might come to forget that they put it out there before Shabbat, and if we tell them, and you're not going to be allowed to retract your hand, so make sure you don't get in that situation. So we're trying to protect people from doing an intentional mistake, right? But let's say his hand is out there above the 10 hand breadths, right? So he's in an indeterminate, condition, okay? And let's say he got out there after Shabbat began. So he stuck his hand out after Shabbat began, or before Shabbat began, but now it's out there. And what we're unsure about is whether he should, if we don't let him bring his arm back in, so he'll just drop it. then he won't have the object anymore. But then he would have deposited it outside. And because there's certain situations, I'm not naming this exactly right, but what I'm trying to say is they're trying to create a law and trying to create a behavior, right? Trying to condition people to have a behavior. And they have to decide in crafting that law, are they trying to help the person who unwittingly gets into a situation where if he pulls his hand back in, he's going to violate Shabbos, so he's going to have to keep his arm out there. Or if he drops the thing because he's just going to get tired, or not get tired, but he's going to drop the thing so that he doesn't have to suffer until, if he gets so tired that his hand just shakes and he drops it, not on purpose, so then the situation's over, that's not his fault. But before he gets to that total, failure of his muscle, he'll probably just drop it because he doesn't want to deal with this anymore. And if we say that he can't, that it's rabbinically prohibited to drop the thing, right? Then we've set up a situation where he violated a rabbinic prohibition, but we might be protecting him from violating a Torah prohibition, right? It's like one extended his hand outside before Shabbat and night fell. Can he retract? This is disputed. The goal is to keep him from violating a Torah prohibition. Do we want to prevent him from getting in that situation in the first place so we don't allow him to retract his hand? Or do we want him to not have to drop it so we allow him to retract, and then we have sort of less incentive to prevent people from getting into that situation in the first place? That's the basic principle that we're dealing here, right? We don't have to make choices like this because we're not legislating, right, the way the sages were. But if we ever are legislating, right, like maybe we're just involved in government, or we're an elected official, or we're in a management committee at work, or we're in a management committee of an organization that we work for. Maybe you're on the board of the synagogue, and you're weighing unintended consequences, right? And the idea is you can create a law that is very strict and penal, and that people are aware of it, so they'll avoid getting themselves into a situation where that penalty will apply, right? That's like just, and in fact, if you think about just having a harsh penalty for a law, for a law, years ago there was a big discussion about crack, right? Crack had much greater penalties than powder cocaine, even though it was like the same amount of the illegal drug. Crack had a bigger penalty than the powder cocaine because cities wanted to crack down on the people who were buying and selling crack in the streets, and they were considered more dangerous, right? But then what if, like some kid, some teenager who's just trying to make a little money doesn't realize, how big the prohibition is that he's violating, and all he did was try to make $30, so he could buy a new pair of sneakers, and now he's facing life in prison because there's this harsh draconian law, right? So then you're weighing, will having the huge penalty prevent people from getting involved with those drugs in the first place, or do we want to have a less severe penalty so that when people actually do get in that situation, we can create a more equitable outcome, right? Those are the kinds of factors that come into play, and we're using this kind of extreme hypothetical situation of the person who stuck his arm out before Shabbat began. Now it's out there, he's holding an object, and what do we want him to do, right? That's the principle that we're working with here. Let me know if there are any questions with that. I'll just scan the comments in case you have one. Martin Lee says, better late than never. Duluth, Minnesota. May Hashem richly bless you and Nina and the work and offering that you bring to us. You and she sparked me into interest on learning more about my Jewish heritage. What a rich culture and heritage our people share. Thank you so much, Martin Lee. That was a beautiful, beautiful comment. We appreciate that. All right, that's what I have got for us today here on Shabbos Daf Gimel, page 3. God's help, we'll be back tomorrow on Daf Dalet, page 4. And hopefully we're going to start to get our rhythm and understand both the implications and the technical administration of these laws, so we can start to penetrate them and understand what it is exactly that our sages are wrestling with here in the laws of Shabbos. Sending you big love from LA.